How did tiny medieval Scotland keep beating back the mighty English war machine? We're told it was all heart. Brave underdogs, heroic charges, doomed last stands. But when you look at the actual campaigns, a different pattern appears. Time and again, Scottish commanders turned English strengths into weaknesses, with tactics England simply couldn't copy. By the end of this episode, you'll see that Scotland's real secret weapon wasn't a single battlefield trick. It was a whole way of fighting a stronger enemy on your own terms. We love this story, right? Brave Scots wode on their faces enormous swords, standing in a muddy field, wildly outnumbered, somehow snatching victory from the jaws of certain death. Films like Braveheart and a lot of later romantic history lean hard into that David versus Goliath narrative. England as this organised, disciplined, armoured juggernaut, and Scotland as a bunch of half-naked lunatics who win through sheer rage and patriotism. It's a brilliant story. It's just not the full story. Because when you zoom out and look at the wars of independence and the campaigns that followed, you see something else. Scots choosing when and where to fight. English armies bogged down, starved and ambushed, cavalry charges that should have wiped out Scottish infantry, simply breaking and dying on walls of spears. So in this episode, we're going to ask, what did Scotland actually do differently? What could Scotland do that England couldn't copy? And were Scottish victories really lucky breaks, or the result of a very deliberate playbook? Let's start with the most famous Scottish secret weapon. And it wasn't a sword, it was a formation, the Schiltron. Imagine a dense block of infantry packed shoulder to shoulder, all holding long spears or pikes angled outwards. A hedgehog of steel. These formations were specifically designed to stop what medieval commanders relied on most, the heavy cavalry charge. Early versions of the Schiltron were used at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. The Scots formed static spear circles that could, in theory, resist cavalry. But they were vulnerable to English longbow fire and were eventually broken. So here's the key. The Scots adapted. By the time of Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce had turned the Schiltron from a static, please don't trample us formation into an offensive weapon. He drilled his men so those pike blocks could move in formation, advancing as a solid wall of spear points. This was a genuine tactical innovation. The English plan at Bannockburn relied on their armoured knights smashing relatively light infantry. Instead, they galloped into prepared ground, pits and obstacles, and then straight into tightly drilled Schiltrons that refused to break. We often hear that 3,000 Scots beat 15,000 English at Bannockburn. The numbers are debated, but what's not debated is the outcome. English cavalry were mauled. Contemporary and modern analysis agree that poorly supported heavy cavalry is extremely vulnerable to dense spear formations on the right terrain. And that's the other part of the Scottish advantage, terrain selection. At Stirling Bridge, the Scots forced a larger English army to cross a narrow bridge, attacking as they emerged and preventing them from deploying properly. At Bannockburn, Bruce chose ground that restricted cavalry with marshes and pits, funneling the English into kill zones. This is not primitive warfare. This is understanding how your enemy expects to win. Designing a formation that flips that strength into a weakness, training your men hard enough that they can hold that formation under absolute terror. Or to put it in modern terms, if you're bringing thousands of expensive war horses to a fight and the other guy has invented anti-horse mode, you're in trouble. So myth number 1. The myth. Scottish victories were just lucky breaks. Reality. The Schiltron, used on carefully chosen terrain, systematically neutralised the English cavalry advantage. And once you do that, the mighty English army suddenly looks a lot less invincible. But Schiltrons weren't Scotland's only trick. Even the best pike square isn't going to help you if the enemy can starve you, surround you and hit you from two sides at once. That's where Scotland's other secret weapon comes in. a different style of warfare in the Highlands and borders, and an alliance that meant England was almost never fighting on just one front. Let's zoom out from the battlefield to the map of Europe. In 1295, Scotland signed what became known as the Auld Alliance with France, a military and diplomatic pact aimed squarely at their shared problem, England. This is often treated as a nice bit of romantic history, good for rugby trophies and wine imports. But militarily, it was a nightmare for the English planners. Here's why it mattered. 1. Two-front pressure. If England attacked Scotland, France could attack English holdings in France. If England went all in against France, Scotland could raid across the northern border. That meant English kings were constantly worried about being stretched too thin. They couldn't just throw everything at Scotland and hope for a quick, crushing victory, because doing that might open the door for a French offensive in Europe. Even when French armies weren't literally marching alongside Scots, the threat of the coordination forced England to divide attention, resources and troops. 2. Flow of tactics, troops and tech. The alliance wasn't just on paper. Over the later Middle Ages, thousands of Scots fought in France and French commanders and knights fought in Scotland. Scottish troops served in French armies and even in the personal guard of the French kings. That kind of contact matters. Scottish commanders saw firsthand how major continental powers fought. They brought back experience in siegecraft, fortifications and combined arms. Scottish nobles and mercenaries gained access to continental equipment and training. Again, we're not saying Scotland had better tech than England overall. England was a wealthy kingdom with strong armourers and fleets. But through this alliance, Scotland plugged itself into a wider European military network, instead of being isolated on a rainy rock in the North Atlantic. 3. Economic and psychological warfare. The alliance also amplified something the Scots were already good at: economic warfare. Rather than always standing in front of English armies in open battle, Scottish leaders, especially Robert the Bruce, repeatedly used scorched-earth tactics and raids to make invasions expensive and unsustainable. Bruce and his commanders emptied and burned areas the English were about to march through, removed livestock and grains so invading armies had nothing to eat, hit garrisons, foraging parties and supply convoys in quick raids, then vanished into difficult terrain. Now add the Auld Alliance to that picture. England is pouring money into campaigns in France. At the same time, Scottish raids are burning manors and crops in the north of England. Every lost wagon, every burnt harvest is money and manpower England can't use elsewhere. One modern historian summary of Bruce is basically master of guerrilla warfare. He won not by chasing glory in big open battles, but by making English rule in Scotland unworkably expensive until they had to cut their losses. So myth number 2. Myth: Scots were always outnumbered and outgunned. Reality: through the Auld Alliance and economic warfare, Scotland turned its weakness into a strategic trap that drained English resources across 2 fronts. England had more men, more money, and more metal. Scotland's advantage was making sure that never mattered as much as it should have. Now let's tackle a couple of related myths at once. Highland warfare was primitive. The English always had superior military technology. Highland warfare looks primitive if you judge it by French fields and tournament rules. It makes a lot more sense when you realise how much of Scotland is mountains, bogs, glens and narrow passes. Highland light infantry and guerrilla tactics. In that environment, heavy armoured knights and tight-packed missile lines are not king. What is king? Fast-moving light infantry, men who know every hill path and ford. The ability to vanish into the landscape and reappear somewhere very inconvenient. Highland and Isles warriors specialised in ambushes, hitting columns as they stretched out along narrow routes. Night raids, smashing camps, burning supplies, stealing livestock. Hit and run attacks, inflicting casualties and then melting back into ground that heavy troops struggled to cross. These were highly specialised tactics for that terrain, not a lack of sophistication. They're exactly what modern militaries would call irregular or guerrilla warfare, and Bruce used them for years to grind down English control even when he couldn't risk a big set-piece battle. The Scottish bow question. What about technology, especially the famous longbow? It's true, the English and Welsh longbow, deployed in large disciplined units, was one of the most effective weapon systems in medieval Europe. It contributed heavily to English victories not just in France, but also over Scottish armies at battles like Falkirk and Highland Hill. So does that mean Scots were miles behind? Not really. Archaeology and records suggest that throughout Britain, including Scotland, people used powerful hunting and war bows. The difference was mainly how many trained archers you could field and how you used them. Scots did deploy archers, often from the Highlands and Isles, and in combination with spearmen and light cavalry, at Bannockburn for example, Scottish archers helped harass and disrupt English formations once their cavalry was blunted by Schiltrons and bad ground. So the reality is, England had a more systematic archery programme and could field huge bodies of longbowmen. Scotland used bows more selectively as part of combined arms tactics, supporting Schiltrons, raids and pursuits. In other words, the Scots weren't technologically incapable, they just couldn't match England arrow for arrow. So they leaned harder into the tactics and terrain where English longbows mattered less. Combined arms Scottish style meant Schiltron infantry holding the line and breaking cavalry, light infantry and Highlanders raiding, screening and harassing, archers hitting exposed or disordered enemy troops, light cavalry used for scouting, flanking and pursuit, not suicidal front-on charges. Again, not primitive, just optimised for Scottish problems, not French plains. So myth number 3, myth. Highland warfare was primitive and England always had superior tech. Reality, Highland tactics were specialised for brutal terrain, and Scottish forces combined infantry, archers and cavalry in ways that often sidestepped England's biggest advantages. At this point, someone always says, OK, fine, Scotland had some clever tricks, but England eventually conquered Scotland. So how secret or successful were these weapons really? Good question, and the answer actually helps prove the point. First, we have to separate two very different things. Military defeat on the battlefield, political union and dynastic change. Through the late 13th and 14th centuries, despite multiple invasions, massacres, sieges and crushing defeats, Scotland remained an independent kingdom. The first wars of independence end with a Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, formally recognising Scotland's independence with Robert the Bruce as king. That's not what you'd expect if English military power was simply overwhelming and Scottish tactics were lucky chaos. Later on, the Union of Crowns in 1603, when James VI of Scotland also became James I of England, wasn't the result of some epic English victory over Scottish armies. It was a dynastic accident. The Tudor line in England ran out of direct heirs, and the next legitimate monarch happens to be the King of Scotland. Then the Act of Union in 1707 was primarily a political and economical deal hammered out between elites, not the result of English armies finally working out how to beat Scottish tactics. There were military pressures in the background, sure, but no Bannockburn in reverse where Scotland's army is decisively wiped off the map. Meanwhile, many of the methods that worked so well for Scots, flexible infantry formations, terrain exploitation, economic warfare, became part of the wider British military toolbox later on. So myth number 4. Myth. England's eventual political union with Scotland proved Scottish military methods were inferior. Reality. Scotland maintained independence for centuries because of those methods, and union came through dynasties and diplomacy, not a final crushing military defeat. If anything, England learned from Scotland that raw power isn't everything in war. So, did Scotland really have a secret weapon against England? Not one, several. Schiltron pike formations, drilled to move and hold on chosen ground, that could turned elite cavalry into very expensive casualties. Highland light infantry and guerrilla tactics, perfectly adapted to brutal terrain and chewed up heavy forces. Economic warfare, scorched-earth cattle raids and supply line attacks that made holding Scotland ruinously costly. Combined arms, infantry, archers and light cavalry working together to exploit English mistakes. And the Auld Alliance, tying England into a two-front problem it could never fully solve. So, verdict. It's fact. Scotland developed systematic military advantages that often neutralised England's superior numbers and resources. Scottish victories weren't just luck. They were the result of deliberate innovation, ruthless adaptation, and a deep understanding of how to fight a stronger enemy on your own ground. And yet, for all that tactical brilliance, Scotland's greatest wound didn't come from a battlefield at all. In the next episode, we're leaving the spear walls and cavalry charges behind and going to the accounting books. We'll look at how an economic decision, not a military defeat, helped set the stage for one of Scotland's greatest tragedies, the Highland clearances. If you want to follow that story and the rest of Scotland Uncovered, feel free to subscribe and stick around, because the myths about Scotland don't stop on the battlefield. Thanks for watching.